Blue Snowball, are you there? Blue Snowball. Hello. Are you there? Blue. What's going on, you guys? It's your boy 3 Stickity Stacks in this thing, baby. Representing TKLG. I am going to start a new series, which is called Revisiting the Past. And in this series, I'm going to go over older decks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring you guys profiles based on lists that were possible in that time frame, based on the ban list, and also what was actually being represented in the format. This is stimulating from a format that is not long forgotten because it's one of the best formats ever. It was not the healthiest, but to be honest, we've never really had like a perfect healthy format, but it was one of the healthiest. It had so much interactivity, so many different decks had their own win conditions where you actually, there were outs, and there were outs that every deck could play that were generic. And on top of that, the decks that were thriving in this era were like Burning Abyss, Shaddolls, Necros. Oh, you can't forget Necros. Necros was just so popular. And you obviously had this deck, STELLARKNIGHTS. You had Ritual Beast. You also had Cleaforts. Those were like the most popular. Some people were playing Yang Zings, but it wasn't as popular. Infernoids came out a little bit later. You know what I mean? That deck came out a little bit later. It wasn't around from the jump. But Infernoids did come into that era where those decks were still popping, and Infernoids kind of just a different breed. But STELLARKNIGHTS were just so good. This actually was my favorite deck for a long time. The reason why it was my favorite deck was not about how good it is, because it's an incredible deck. It's very straightforward, and for a lot of people, you know, I don't know about y'all, but sometimes you just feel like you have a pea brain. You just want to play something really easy and super effective that you know is going to clap some cheeks. Bruh, people were playing STELLARKNIGHTS because this deck was very nice. My reason for it being my favorite deck is totally different from other people's reasons. This was my favorite deck because I follow the lore of Yu-Gi-Oh! And the STELLARKNIGHTS are direct descendants of the Constellars, which was another one of my favorite decks. I followed the lore of this deck so crucially. I learned about the evil swarms, where they came from, how Gishki Noelia was really grimy, and she used the Steel Swarm virus and brought back the Ice Dragon berries and spreaded all this chaos. Man, and that also reminds me of Shaddolls, because Shaddolls are very similar to the evil swarms, how they took over archetypes and kind of corrupted them. But the Constellars in that time frame, they actually had the Vylons under them. The Vylons was like their underdogs, and they were kind of overseeing and watching over things. The Constellars were literal star constellations, and then their descendants are actually the STELLARKNIGHTS. I don't want to get too deep into the lore, but I do have those jewels to drop for people that like the lore. I'm a pretty nerdy guy when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't even have no shame in it. But this deck was one of my favorite decks because they were cousins to my Constellars, and I loved my Constellars. I loved that deck so much. It was such a cool, fun, and just different kind of deck. I mean, a lot of decks back then, rank 4 toolboxes were some of the best decks you could play because rank 4 XYZs had some of the best effects in that time frame. You had just generically strong XYZs that any deck could put out if they could slap 2 level 4s. And this deck was arguably the best rank 4 toolbox deck in that time with a cool kind of different twist because it could loop continuous traps over and over and over off of Trivier or Triver. I just like calling her Trivier because it sounds sexy. And it was just really good with resource management. This deck would always have follow-ups where other rank 4 toolbox decks didn't always have that. So this deck could grind extremely well. It could recycle its negates, its floodgates, everything. It was just such a good deck. It's very solid. This deck actually won Worlds in 2015. This deck was able to main all the meta hate. You could main the Shadow Imprisoning Mirror for your Shaddol matchup and your BA matchup. This deck had an incredible Necros matchup because Necros were not that great with playing through a ton of back rows. They were decent, but then this deck could also main Anti-Spell and also could play Mistake. This deck was just like an anti-meta, not Dark Horse because it was popular. There was another deck that was similar like Cleaforts, but STELLARKNIGHTS were easier. Cleaforts had their own gimmick. A lot of people stayed away from Pendulums because, I'm not going to lie, Pendulums are hated now. You guys have to realize, in that time, Pendulums were hated even more. People just did not like... Pendulums have just never really been liked. There is a actual community that loves Pendulums, and they like are diehard fans, but Pendulums have never ever been well received in our format, like ever. Just in Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot of people just never accepted them. So this was like the go-to control deck for a lot of people, and rightfully so because it was so good at what it did. This deck had answers to the answers. I'm talking about, bruh. This deck had answers to answers. This deck was clapping cheeks, bro. And Phoenix Chain, the Loop of Triver, was just way too good, bro. It was just way too good. This deck was ahead of its time. So let's go ahead and get into my list. This was a time when Reinforcement was at 3. Later on, down into 2015, there was another ban list that hit this to 1. But in this time frame, Rhoda was at 3. So we were able to play 3 Reinforcement of the Army. And I liked playing 3 Duality because a lot of your more explosive plays come later on into the duel. Your first turn is more about setting up, and sometimes even your second turn you're still getting there. Your third turn and so on and so forth, a lot more explosive plays happen, and that's where you don't really need Duality. But just to be able to draw your outs to the Genlock, to be able to draw your floodgates that you side deck, you would sideboard into the mistakes and anti-spells because they were better for going first and less situational if you lost the die roll. I just really like Duality. It's a great card. I even at first wanted to go into 3 Upstart because it was just such a good deck dinner, but I decided to play real cards that did something other than a card that just made my deck, thinner, more consistent, which is nothing wrong with that when you want to draw your floodgates. And then for the last power spell, we were playing Soul Charge. This card is so good in this deck. Bruh, this card is just way too fire. Soul Charge is amazing. Because all your Satellas get their effects on summon. So this card, you could plus so much off of a Soul Charge. It didn't even matter that you didn't have your battle phase. And another cool thing with this deck was there was not a lot of, let me be very specific with this, there was not a lot of non-targeting, non-destruction removal. This deck had that, and it had that in, bro, I'm talking about this deck had it like in the wraps, bro. Like I'm talking about this deck legit had so much because you could loot Triver all the time and keep ripping cards out of your opponent's hand. And then these cards, the XYZs were always worth going into, like your bigger ones, the STELLARKNIGHTS, because they floated on top of that. They were just so good. They were like combo enablers, bro. Like this deck was just so good. Like there was not very many decks that had non-targeting and non-destruction removal. Like Shadal's didn't really like have that. Like you could make Trishula if you were playing Glow Bulb. There were actually combos you could do a Glow Bulb, but it's like the point is non-targeting, non-destruction removal was scarce in that format. There was not very many decks that'll have it, and if they did have it, they didn't have it consistently. Like Towers was just a different breed, but a lot of Cleafor decks either sideboarded Towers or actually did not play it. Especially because this deck actually had the out to Towers. This card was just so good. This card was ahead of its time too. But yeah, I'm kind of like sidetracking. Like this deck is just so nice, you guys. It's just so good, bro. Like it was just so good. So we have 3 Deneb, 3 Unicauhide, the ukulele, 3 Altair, this is your Wolf Bark, 1 Vega, and then this is a nice little spicy tech here. So the reason why you wanted to play Regal, or at least I would, because if I was still playing in this format, I would never want to be caught dead without a Regal. Why? Because this card was your out to Winda and an out to Unicorn, which those cards could be very annoying to deal with. Why? Because he's a 19 beat stick, and he can literally buff a Satellarknight by 500. You send it to the grave during the end phase, but it didn't really matter because you only use them for that turn. So you had 4 Rhoda. You had 4 copies of him because of the 3 Rhoda, and then you had the Neb too to search him just to use him later. But this card would just out Unicorn, and it would also out Winda, which is super important. The Genlock was a different breed because they had, obviously, a lot of people weren't on Gungnir, but they normally, good Necros players were always ending with Valkyries. Valkyries was like just so, like Valkyries is not that good right now in 2021, but back then, he was just ahead of his time, bro. Like that card was obnoxiously good. It made the Necros deck so annoying to deal with because they could stall you out for so long and just keep building their resources. And this was one of the few decks that had trouble with playing around Trish, because even if you would you would have to literally set your whole hand, but a lot of times you couldn't do that because you would want Deneb to resolve, but sometimes you have to make awkward plays to play around Trish. But even then, you would still play into it no matter what, because you would always have back row, you would always have something engraved, and then eventually you're going to start getting cards in your hand when you start looping the Nev off THIER. So it was like very hard to not play in the Trish with this deck. Luckily, you had so many answers to that card, but you had ways to do it. This card was just so nice. Like Wriggle was so nice. There was other really cool tricks with this deck. Like something I learned playing this deck was like there was an infinite resource loop off of Emerald, where you could actually just summon your Emerald, recycle your Triver, and then you could either bring the Emerald back off Call the Haunted, or if it never died, you could summon Trigger and return him back to your extra deck, and then summon him, and then recycle your Trigger, and you just never ran out of Trigger. You just never ran out of stuff. Like, you actually couldn't deck out because Emerald Recycle is even your main deck, so I'm just saying, bro. And Recycle those Altairs is just so good. There's just, like, some cool tricks that some people just really didn't know. Like, there was not a lot of players back then that were innovative. Honestly, like, all the innovative players were ahead of their time too, because most people did what's done now. Like, they just stuck to what everybody else did, and if everybody wasn't doing it, they were too scared to try new stuff. So there was just, like, so much room for innovation, and anything that was spicy, bruh, it just, like, you had to keep it under wraps. You could not share your spice with nobody. I'm telling you, bro. But anyways, we have 3 MST. MST was just so important in that format. Obviously, it sucks in certain matchups, but truth be told, don't ever want to be caught dead without the out, bruh. Like, you just need MST. The Clear 4 deck was like the floodgate deck, to be honest, and it was really important to have an out to Vanities in certain instances. You would obviously MST another back row and let Vanities fall off by itself, but you just really needed back row removal, including for people who are psychos. They would play Light Imprisoning Mirror, and they also would play Mistake. And those kind of psychos, you want to catch them with that MST, bro. Then we had Raigeki, Book of Moon, Compulse, and Ring of Destruction, and Torrential Tribute. These were 5 Genlock outs. You could out the Genlock theoretically if they don't have Valkyries, but it's like, it was so rare that they would ever not have the Valkyries to end the battle phase. So you really couldn't use Regal, but technically speaking, Regal isn't out to Genlock if they didn't have Valk, but it was like, when did they not have the Valk, bro? It was just so annoying. So you needed Raigeki or Book. Compulse, Ring, and Torrential were slower, but they still got the job done. You just really needed multiple outs to the Genlock. You never, like, I'm going to use that phrase a few times, but you didn't want to be caught dead without certain cards in that format. These were like, this is at 1 now, but like, this is at 3 now, this is at 3 now, this is at 3 now. But this is a totally different format, and these cards, when you drew them, you didn't want to use them right away. These were cards that you wanted to hold, or at least a smart player would. Some people just use cards just because they can, but not me, bro. If I was in this format still, I would still be the same cautious, conservative, mid-range duelist that I am, and just be really, really smart and patient. With your blowout cards like TT and Ring, all your 1-ups, you never want to use them too early, including Soul Charge. Like, you really want to be patient with certain plays, and that's what would make you a good Stellarknight player, because the deck's already super simple, so a lot of your skill can just adapt and basically be used on proper timing, resource management, and also sequencing your plays in the correct orders, because when you're using traps, there is an order. There's levels to this stuff, bro. So now we're moving on to 3 Alpha. This card is just so broken, bro. Like, this card right here, there was really nothing like it except like Scolding, but people that played Scolding didn't really play other traps, obviously. So there was very few cards that were like Alpha in this format. So this card, you just could not play any less than 3. It was just way too good. Negate, draw, play another one. Oh, so good. And the pluses, when you send an Altair off of it when you already use his effect, like the last turn, then you flip a Call or an Oasis and bring them back. The pluses, bro, the pluses. Then we have Triple Phoenix Chain. This card is also extremely good in this format. It was just our effect veiler. You didn't mind taking a turn off to negate an effect, because a lot of the times your boards were really hard to deal with because your opponent had to play into those back rows. And you just, it's like, we don't have Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched and Feather Duster. So like, back row decks were really prevalent then, because there was very few like sacks that would just wipe the entire slate of back rows. So people had to be very cautious and calculated, and they had to systematically play through your board, 1-for-1ing you, and hoping that you still don't have an out after they've tried their best to force out your Alpha. A lot of people try to force this card out, but another thing with good Stellarknight players is we hold our Alpha, bro. We hold our Alpha. Like, I do this to this day. If I have negates, I hold them for what actually would break my board. I'll let my opponent advance his game state all he wants. He can draw 2 and do all that stuff he wants to do. He can activate cards to search and special summon all day. But the moment I see a card that says this can break your board, that's what I negate. See, bro, I'm telling you, like, I'm not alone, but some of us Yu-Gi-Oh players, bro, we just different breeds. Like, cause some people, like, if you're playing against Drytron, right, talking modern Yu-Gi-Oh, people Ash prep, people like Gold Spell Prep, they Ash Cyber Emergency, you should just hold it for the actual Drytrons. Or like when you're going against certain decks, like when you have a Dragoon up and a Savage and a Seal, and your opponent just activates a card like Prosperity. Like, why do you negate that card? Like, some people just do it. I just don't understand. But, like, that's why everybody doesn't top events. That's the truth. But Alpha, this was one of those cards you would hold, bro. Like, you would hold this. This is what made this deck so annoying, too, because your opponent had to play as if you had the Alpha. This card almost was like Shaddoll Fusion. Like, people would play around this the best they could, and they would try not to lose too many resources off of this card. Like, Shaddoll Fusion was just much stronger. It defined and warped the format, and people would literally not in on extra deck monsters just so they wouldn't get punished by it. But this card was very similar in the sense that people played around it because they knew it was in your list, so they were always trying to bait this card, but you never took the bait. You just let them hit whatever they could hit and force what they could force, and you flip this on the play because a lot of people hold their best plays for last, and that's what I do. So I know that my Alpha is going to be a lot more impactful the longer I wait to use it. And so there's some skill to this, man. It's